I didn't go to Lucas's house expecting anything to change. It was supposed to be an ordinary visit, the kind we'd done 100 times before: pizza boxes on the counter, a game murmuring on the TV, the comfort of a place that never asked questions. Lucas and I had been friends since college, bonded by late nights and shared jokes, by the quiet understanding that comes from spending too much time together. He was easy in his skin. I wasn't. That difference had always felt manageable. Until that afternoon. Lucas lived in a modest suburban home with a clipped lawn and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. His mother was at work, his younger sister out with friends. His father, Mark, was home early, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes spread before him like a puzzle he'd given up on solving. Mark was in his mid-40s, tall, composed, the kind of man who spoke carefully, as if words mattered more to him than most people. I met him plenty of times, exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. "Hey, Ethan," he said, looking up with a faint smile. "You hungry?" "Always," I answered, trying to sound lighter than I felt. I had come over because my apartment felt too small that day, because my thoughts had grown loud. Lucas clapped me on the shoulder and disappeared to his room to change, leaving me alone with his father in the kitchen. Mark handed me a soda and asked about my classes, my plans, the questions adults ask when they want to be kind without getting close. I answered honestly, but briefly. He listened in a way that felt deliberate, not distracted. When Lucas returned, the moment passed, and we settled into our usual rhythm, talking, laughing, killing time. Tea wasn't until later, when Lucas went to shower, that Mark spoke again. "Ethan," he said, lowering his voice. "Could you give me a hand with something?" I hesitated, unsure why my chest tightened at the request. "Sure," I said. Daddy led me down the hall to a small room off the den, used mostly for storage. Boxes lined the walls. The air smelled faintly of dust and paper. Mark closed the door, not all the way, just enough to soften the noise from the house. He gestured to a chair. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I just wanted to talk." The words were ordinary. The tone wasn't. He asked how Lucas was doing at school, whether I thought he seemed happy. I answered, careful, aware that I was stepping into territory that wasn't mine. Mark nodded, absorbing my words, then surprised me by talking about himself. He spoke about work, about feeling like time had sped past him without permission. There was no complaint in his voice, only a tired honesty. "You ever feel like you're standing still while everything else moves?" he asked. The question landed closer than I expected. "Yeah," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between us. I told myself it was nothing, just a shared moment, just empathy. Still, I noticed the way he held my gaze a second longer than necessary, the way the room felt smaller with the door nearly shut. When Lucas called my name from down the hall, I exhaled, relieved. Mark stepped back, clearing space between us as if he'd sensed my unease. "Thanks for listening," he said. "You're good for him." I returned to the living room, my thoughts scattered. Lucas asked what his dad wanted, and I shrugged, too quickly. "Just talking," I said, which was true in the narrowest sense. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but the house felt different to me now, as if I'd seen a crack in something solid. When I left, Mark met my eyes again from the kitchen doorway, his expression unreadable. Driving home, I replayed the moment in that small room, searching for meaning where I insisted there was none. I told myself not to be dramatic, not to invent significance. And yet, beneath the reassurance, a quiet certainty settled in. Whatever had begun wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, contained, and already impossible to ignore. After that visit, I told myself not to overthink things. I went back to my routine, classes, work, the careful distance I kept between myself and questions I wasn't ready to answer. But when Lucas invited me over again a few days later, I said yes too quickly, ignoring the faint warning in my chest. I framed it as loyalty to a friend. I didn't admit how curious I felt about his father, about the quiet gravity Mark carried with him. The second visit felt different from the moment I stepped inside. Mark was home again, moving through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. He greeted me with the same calm smile, but his eyes lingered, as if he were taking inventory of something he'd misplaced and found again. Lucas barely noticed. He never did notice what happened beneath the surface, that we settled into a pattern that formed without discussion. Lucas would drift off to take a call or step outside, and Mark would find me in the kitchen or the den. Our conversations grew longer, more personal. He asked about my childhood, my parents, the expectations I felt pressing down on me. I didn't mean to answer so honestly. The words came out because he made space for them. "You carry a lot," Mark said once, after I confessed how alone I often felt even in crowded rooms. "So do you," I replied before thinking he didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned against the counter and told me about his marriage, not in dramatic detail, but with a restrained sadness that made it worse. He spoke of years spent being dependable, invisible, necessary but not desired. Listening to him stirred something in me that felt uncomfortably like recognition, that I began to notice the small things. The way he remembered details I'd mentioned only once. The way he seemed to wait for my reactions, as if they mattered. When our hands brushed passing a plate or a glass, the contact lingered in my mind long after the moment ended. Nothing happened, and yet everything felt charged. Guilt crept in quietly. Lucas trusted me. He talked about his plans, his future, assuming I was firmly on his side. I nodded, smiled, played my part. But part of me was always listening for Mark's footsteps, always aware of where he was in the house. That awareness frightened me more than attraction ever could. Point one afternoon, Mark asked me to help him sort through old paperwork in the den. Lucas was upstairs, headphones on, lost in his own world. The den door remained open, but the intimacy of the task felt deliberate. As we worked, Mark spoke softly, his voice stripped of its usual caution. "I shouldn't talk to you like this," he said, not looking up. "But you make it easy." The words settled heavily between us. I felt exposed, chosen in a way I hadn't asked for but couldn't reject. "I don't want to cause problems," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was reassuring, him or myself. "I know," Mark replied. "I never want that." It was a promise and an admission all at once. I realized then that the line had already been crossed, not by touch, but by intent. We were sharing parts of ourselves that should have remained guarded. The secrecy itself had become a bond. After that day, I found myself pulling back, answering Mark with shorter responses, keeping physical distance. He noticed immediately. The warmth in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something like regret. Seeing it hurt more than I expected. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked quietly as I was leaving one evening. "No," I said, and meant it. "I just need to be careful." He nodded, accepting the boundary without protest. Yet as I drove home, the relief I expected never came. Instead, there was a hollow ache, the realization that restraint didn't undo what had already taken root. That night, I lay awake replaying our conversations, weighing my loyalty to Lucas against the truth I hadn't named aloud. I told myself I could still fix this. That distance would restore order. But even as I clung to that hope, I knew it was fragile. The connection between Mark and me hadn't ended. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for the moment neither of us would pretend anymore. The distance I tried to create didn't restore balance. It only sharpened the tension. Lucas noticed first. He started asking why I came over less often, why I seemed distracted when I did. I blamed school, work, the vague pressures of adulthood. He accepted my answers because he trusted me, and that trust weighed heavier than any accusation could have. Mark changed too. He became more formal, careful to keep conversations brief and public. The effort was obvious, almost painful to watch. In trying to protect everyone, he revealed how much there was to protect. The house felt divided into spaces we could no longer share without awareness. And I understood then that secrecy doesn't disappear. It rearranges itself. Point one evening, Lucas left us alone without meaning to. He ran out to meet a friend, promising he'd be back soon. Mark stood in the kitchen, staring at the sink as if it might offer instructions. I considered leaving, but something steadied me in place. "We had avoided the truth long enough. I don't want this to keep hurting," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Mark turned to face me. The restraint he'd practiced slipped, just enough to show exhaustion. "Neither do I," he replied. "I should have known better." The simplicity of the admission surprised me. There was no attempt to shift blame, no grand explanation, just responsibility. It forced me to confront my own part in what had happened. I hadn't been a passive presence. I had listened, leaned in, stayed when I should have stepped back. We can't pretend nothing changed, I said, but we can choose what happens next. He nodded slowly. Lucas can't be the one who pays for this. Hearing his son's name spoken with that clarity settled something in me. This wasn't a romance unfolding. It was a mistake demanding an ending. The realization hurt, but it also brought relief. Wanting something doesn't make it right. Feeling seen doesn't excuse what it costs others. When Lucas returned, laughing as he kicked off his shoes, I felt the full measure of what was at stake. He glanced between us, sensing the shift, but said nothing. The moment passed without drama, which somehow made it worse. Later that night, I told Lucas I needed space. Not forever, just enough to reset what had been blurred. He looked surprised, then disappointed, but he didn't argue. If that's what you need, he said. His willingness to accept my decision without knowing the truth was an undeserved kindness that I stopped coming over after that. Mark and I exchanged one final look in the driveway weeks later, a silent agreement that some connections must be released, not explored. There was sadness in it, but also dignity. Endings don't have to be cruel to be final. Time did what distance alone couldn't. The intensity faded, leaving behind clarity. I understood my attraction better, not as a secret shame, but as a signal I'd misread. I wasn't drawn to Mark because he was forbidden. I was drawn to the attention, the reflection of myself he offered when I felt invisible. Lucas and I rebuilt something slower, more cautious. It wasn't the same as before, and maybe it never could be, but it was honest. I carried the lesson quietly, knowing it would shape how I loved in the future. Sometimes, I think about that small room off the den and how easily it altered my path. Nothing happened there that could be named or pointed to, and yet everything changed. I learned that infidelity isn't defined by touch alone, but by the moments we choose to keep hidden. The story doesn't end with forgiveness or condemnation. It ends with awareness, the kind that lingers, asking you to look harder at your choices. And even now, I wonder how many lives turn on doors that never fully close.